Tansei, Tanishi, Buju. Welcome to Season 3 of the Traveling Métis podcast, the podcast that dives into Métis culture. Do you hear that? That is the sound of the river, which can only mean one thing. It is time to grab your paddle and your headphones and hop into your canoe, because we are heading down the river to talk to our fellow Michif storytellers. Welcome back to the Traveling Métis podcast. Today it's going to get a little heavy, my Michif friends. Not that being Indigenous in a colonized country isn't already heavy, but today we want you all to take special care while listening to today's episode. We will be discussing the residential school system and opioid crisis as it relates to the work of Métis artist Tracey-Mae Chambers. We are proud of our Michif kin who use their art to create change. We've seen art used throughout history as a means for political and social change. It can be used to start conversations, which I think is a very important thing to point out, that although we are starting conversations with art, including this podcast, it is very important that as individuals, we continue to advocate and make steps towards change in our communities after we are done consuming these creative conversation pieces. I was trying to think of ways to describe the work of Tracey-Mae Chambers for those of you who haven't had the pleasure of seeing it. I will be leaving a link to her website in the show notes so you can take a peek. But in the name of Indigenous sovereignty, I thought it would be best to leave the description of her art up to the artist herself.
My name is Tracey-Mae Chambers. I'm Métis installation artist, I guess is the best way to describe it at this point in time. Although it's always sort of in motion, what we do as artists. And I think, like many artists, I've always been interested in art. That's just, I don't know, part and parcel to perhaps being an artist. You sort of always had that inclination.
Does your heritage and your Métis culture, does that influence the type of art you create? And if it does, how much of that kind of goes into your creative process?
No, it actually doesn't. And I know that's not the answer you probably want, but because my work is mostly driven by either socioeconomic issues or feminist leanings, I'm trying to think of the correct word to say that. So it tends to be more about my reacting to my environment as opposed to an actual heritage reaction, if that makes sense. So I understand that there are other Métis artists who speak through their art through something like beading or something like dot painting, replicating beading and painting. That's never sort of interested me because I don't know if it's not visceral enough, or it's just I'm not able to convey the ideas that I want to in that sort of way. So, or in that medium. So certainly what I want to say, that is the medium that I choose. I know that's one of the questions we want to ask is about medium. And I think that's the medium an artist chooses is important because the idea that they want to express, sometimes some mediums lend themselves to that and others do not, in my practice at any rate. Um, so, so for sure, the way I feel about our culture and about culture in general dictates how I express myself through my work. So I'm reacting to whatever is happening within our culture, but it isn't based upon lived knowledge of X, Y, and Z within the culture. Something like beading or drum making or any of those kinds of things. No, that's not, I don't, I just don't work that way. And I wasn't exposed to the culture as a child, or I didn't grow up within the culture. So that makes a huge difference as well, I'm sure, right? So yeah, and I know for every artist that's quite different. And I'm just happy to be involved, right? And be able to use my work to speak. Um, Whereas I'm not particularly articulate. So this is an easier way for me to talk about something that's probably difficult to talk about some of these issues, right? So, and art's an easier way to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the projects that is, or a topic, I guess, that is difficult to talk about is the residential school system. And you said a lot of your art is the reaction to like social issues and things that are going on. Do you want to talk about your work with Hope and Healing Canada and how that project started? And
Yeah, for sure. So really that's in reaction to what was happening in Kamloops in that time period in 2021. And I wasn't really sure how to talk about that. Like, I'm a sculptor, and how do you sculpt something that's promotes conversation in reaction to something like that? That's not confrontational, right? Because, yeah, if you've seen any of my sculptural work, I mean, I think it'd be difficult to talk about that. So I just, something like being able to use textiles seemed like the right choice. And I think it was in reaction to Kamloops, but it was also the way Canadians in general reacted to it in sort of this aghast kind of surprise, as though they didn't know they were there. But I think generationally, they did know that residential schools existed. And so it was more the reacting to that sort of colonial viewpoint. And I remember at the time, I can't remember the lady's name, but one of the senators in Ottawa said, "Oh, in her response to residential schools was uh, at that time, she said, well, they were just trying to help, right? They were just trying to make these children's lives better and this sort of weird. And that was also part of my reaction was this understanding that that was part of a colonial viewpoint, right? And so then I started delving into reading about colonial viewpoints and colonization, not just here in Canada, but just colonization, right? And what that meant in a larger global sort of perspective. So it's a hashtag. That is the actual title of this body of work. It's hashtag Hope and Healing Canada. And the reason is it was the only way I could get around using Canada with a lowercase c. Now, all the time, people send me information and they have it, Hope and Healing Canada separated words with capitals and things like that. And oftentimes I'll try to correct that, but it's hard to get people to understand that the title is actually a hashtag. Even after 167 installations, it's still problematic because they haven't seen that before. But it was purposeful because people get pissed off if you don't put the capital on Canada, even though there are other artists and protests who are doing that. There's this, and that's another colonial thing, right? This sort of the viewpoint about having this capital and things like that. So it was a way for me to get around that. Again, non-confrontational, but still that tiny little protest of leaving it as a lowercase c. So that was that. So trying to build this body of work was difficult during COVID because there was no place for me to work because everything was shut down. So it was like this, how do I work anyways? I'd already experimented with building installations back in the day. So installation art essentially is taking work into a space where it could be considered unexpected. So it's larger based work Sometimes it's outside, but it tends to take up bigger spaces. And in my case, I wasn't sure how to sort of talk about this subject without doing it as an installation as opposed to one specific small piece or one group of, say, sculptures or something like that. Like I wasn't sure how to convey this trying to dismantle colonization through sculpture. So then I started thinking about maybe the way to do that is by intervening in spaces that usually only tell a white male story, right? So what better place than museums, art galleries, government buildings, all those kinds of places that are generally speaking a singular story. So disrupting that space is the focus of this work, of those spaces rather. So I go into those spaces, build an installation that is filling up some of that space and intervening into that space to start that conversation. Because once you see the work, you're like, why is the work there? And honestly, that's the beginning of the conversation. Even if it's just in someone's head, why is that work there? They may see it as aesthetically pleasing, or they may or not, or think whatever, but they're still thinking about it. And that's the intervention. The conversation mostly is not with me, because my purpose is to go in. Generally speaking, we weren't welcome, whether that's Indigenous folks or female folks or people who are marginalized in any other way, not welcome in those kinds of spaces or don't feel like they're welcome in those kinds of spaces. So intervening and building something in that space starts that question in their head. And so they see it. Generally speaking, there's some sort of a didactic or an information panel that explains it, or a QR code, something, so they can look at it and say, oh, it's here because X, Y, and Z, because of decolonization, because of trying to decolonize these kinds of spaces and tell more than one story, tell everyone's story, newcomer stories. It doesn't matter whose story it is. It needs to include everyone's story if it's on this soil, in my opinion. The reality is something different for other people, but for me, that's part of decolonization, is making sure that everyone's story is told. So I chose yarn because it's sort of hard to get pissed off at yarn, right?
I guess if you tangle it, like.
Well, that's something else entirely. That's a conversation sometimes in my head, sometimes outside of my head, but the tangling of the yarn is 100% part of my own conversation. That happens all the time, but a little less now that I'm more experienced. But so it was, how do you choose a medium that starts conversations without people at one another and not listening to one another, because that happens a lot, as we're seeing, right? Certainly within our own culture right at the moment. Nobody's listening to each other at all. It's just a shit show, right? So being able to go into spaces like that, start a conversation with people that probably would never have spoken to otherwise. This way they can ask questions. Why are you building that? Then when I leave, that didactic is there, but it's the purpose. It's not our job to decolonize these spaces. It's the venue's job, the institution's job. So they take up that conversation once I leave, because they're part of the conversation. I start the conversation. They continue the conversation because they're in the midst of decolonizing whatever it is, their artifacts or archives or repatriation of artifacts or whatever it is that is happening within their structure. So that's the purpose of this body of work. It is just sheerly that. It's simplistic and complicated, right? At the same time, it's a simple medium, but that's what makes it approachable, right? Because there's weaving, crochet, knitting. There's all sorts of different kinds of what would be considered historically female use of materials to express opinions in art, right? Where we weren't allowed to be painters or do, whatever it was. We weren't allowed in those spaces. Again, so even being in that kind of a space, doing something that would have been the only way for me to speak 100 years ago or 150 years ago or whatever in the 70s, really depends on ask the Guerrilla Girls, they still don't think that we're represented, and I agree. So, right? So using something like this in these kinds of places is another layer of political discourse, I think, because it's another way of saying, I'm still using this because you're still not listening, or I'm still not really that welcome in this space as an oil painter or sculptor or any of those kinds of things. So it was the right medium for me. So the question about medium choices is important, not just to me, I think to many artists. And the other sort of reason I chose this medium is because it's accessible, like, to me, right? I can order yarn online, or I could go to Value Village and buy yarn. I can take apart, a crochet blanket at Value Village that somebody isn't using and reuse that yarn. That was the other point of it. And there's always multiple exhibitions happening at the same time with this body of work. And so how could I cost effectively do that? Have, up to 20 or 25 exhibitions happening at the same time and be able to afford to make that amount of work, right? So this was another way to be able to do that. And then it just sort of builds from that. Like the size of the work builds, and the things that I have to learn how to do, right? Because I essentially knew like one crochet stitch when I started, and I didn't know how to do any of the other things. And so it's this learning curve that I didn't necessarily want to be on, but here we are, right? So, yeah, and I feel like I'm never going to sculpt again, because I guess it's sculpture still, it's just in a different format. But I've sometimes I'm like, oh, I really miss sculpting. It's like physically sculpting, but I don't know how I would speak that way or through that medium. So maybe someday I'll go back to that. But
no, it makes a lot of sense, because like even with like the story of how like the drum was made was because the men were off to war and there was a woman who was told to make this. So it's like, it seems like it's always up to women to try to bring people back. Makes total sense that you would tie that into the female.
Yeah, exactly. And it was something I could do during COVID and learn how to, or figure out how to make these works out and about without being in a gallery space or in a museum or wherever, because we weren't allowed to go anywhere, right? So it's not like, yeah, it was difficult at the beginning, but I'm glad sort of that I was home at that time, because that's why the work works, because I was able to have that time to experiment, which generally speaking, artists don't have, because they don't have the luxury of that, right? So, of time. So this way, that's what happened, and it worked out for the best for me.
You talked about like you make the work and then you leave to have others have that conversation, and like the spaces are sort of in charge of trying to have those conversations. Have you been able to hear back from any of those spaces?
The Hope and Healing Canada work was almost all red. And that's a question too. People would be asking about why it was red and why that color choice. And initially it was because it's the most powerful color. And, we think of blood, which is a common denominator, but it's also a racial slur, and anger and love and all those combative relationships, or, the love and hate and those kinds of things. Although we tend to use red to represent those emotions, it was a good it was the only color that I could think of that I could use. I mean, certainly not my favorite color, but it was the right color to choose. So that, even that, again, starts that conversation about decolonization, because people ask that specifically and assume that it's about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, like things like that. And that's good. I mean, that's fine. That's not problematic. And when I say it's the museum's responsibility or the institution's responsibility, I think they take that very seriously. Like everywhere that I've been across Canada, they're thinking about that anyways. These are, academics that are part of this conversation long before I even sort of recognized what decolonization meant and what the tearing down of those institutions that are right in their, board of trustees, like right in every piece of literature that's about a museum or the background of a museum. Like it's like I think of it as like computer programming. So we see one thing, which is the pretty stuff on the surface, and all the code that's in the background is that decolonization is the structure of an institution. So all the writing that you and well, maybe you can, but that I can't understand, that it's about what they cannot and can do within the context of that museum, is all part of a colonial viewpoint and was written by mostly, in Europe and then came here. So, that conversation that's happening at these places is so complicated and so fabulous, I think. And so even just being a little bit of a part of it, the introduction to it, sort of a soft sell kind of thing, I think that's fabulous. So the museums always sort of tell me how that is going, which is great. And when I do an artist talk, we sometimes talk about it in that space as well, which is great. So I listen to it in the artist talk with the questions that are asked and such, and then they listen to how the public in their community is reacting to the work, which is super cool. So so it's been a really positive walkabout kind of thing as I've crossed the countries, and I continue to do so, which is great. And I'm honored to do that, to be there and welcomed into these spaces. I mean, I always get asked that question about, like, have you always been an artist? Like, when did you know you were an artist? Like those kinds of questions. But I think in my mind, it's more about, I feel strongly about certain issues. How do I talk about them not being an academic or not being particularly cerebral? How do you talk about those things and elicit change? Well, I can't, right? Like, I don't, your forum, you can through your forum, especially podcasts right now. But somebody like me, how would I possibly, right, elicit any change or start any conversations as an individual just going about my day? So, like, I'm glad I'm not a painting puppies and kittens kind of person. If it's not, even as a child, I don't think I saw art as, I saw it as protest, right? And there's lots of people who just see it as a visceral reaction to something that's beautiful, and that's fabulous. I think that's wonderful. But I would prefer to be on the other end of that spectrum, where there's a slight discomfort by people, or there's like some sort of question that I'm trying to answer for myself, or I want to look at it as being purposeful as opposed to just aesthetic. And I think it can be both things, right? Pretty and political. There's no reason that it can't be those things in my mind. So so I know I recognize how lucky I am being able to do this as my vocation.
The artists who are trying to like infuse the activism, like, would you say like your advice would be to like also just let like the work speak for itself? Because like you said, like you just create it, and then the museums and all that, like it's up to the audience to come in and interpret.
And if all they get out of it is, wow, that's pretty. Okay, at least they looked at it, and at least they recognized, wait, why is that there, right? Not everything has to be a big discussion or something, right? And not everything has to be a fight either.
You were talking about like before, like internally people, like sometimes you don't always see the change happen in someone's mind. Like they could be looking at it and you're not really seeing it outright, but they could go about their life and it could have made like an impact on them that you didn't even know.
Right. Even if it's just the smallest thing of just saying, oh, I never really thought about the fact that that could be there, or about repatriation or of artifacts, or like things like that they never would have thought about before. That certainly I think Canadians are thinking about now, which is great, right? Like that's, who would have thought, or I certainly wouldn't have thought that would have been something that would have happened in my lifetime. But that's the way the things are moving, and that's fabulous, I think.
Yeah, and you were talking about choosing like the different mediums, like maybe a sculpture would have been a bit more aggressive for people to see.
Oh, hell yeah.
It would have probably been a whole different project if it had been like sculptures in these museums.
Yeah, exactly. And then how do you make that so that it's an intervention into a space? Like unless it's like a like I don't even know how I'd make something large enough unless I changed mediums to like steel, which I don't want to do. So how would you do that? I think the other thing I like about working with something like fiber too is that some of it is natural fibers and some of it is not, but no matter what, it all decays. And so people are so sort of strange. Well, it's like they want everything to be permanent, which is such crap, right? Because nothing is. So they see a steel sculpture and they're like, oh, well, that's permanent. I don't think so. You know what I mean? Like it's just this such a egotistical way to view art. It's a strange thing to me, and to each their own, right? Like but I like the fact that the installation right now at Aga Khan Museum, which is in Toronto, it's outside. And part of that installation was some of the work that was on the front of Rideau Hall. So it had been outside for 6 months at Rideau Hall. And now, so it's on one side, it's faded, right? So there's silk, like recycled silk and different kinds of wool, acrylic. I don't know. There's like all these different types of material within this installation, and that all fades differently, right? Or weathers differently. And so what I did was because it was on a wall at Rideau Hall when it's at Aga Khan, it's actually, you can see both sides. So you can see that it's quite bright red on one side and it's faded like oranges, and the purples are faded lavender and these kinds of things. And I love that. So whereas some people would say, but it's not the same. But it is. And it sort of, to me, it carries those stories as it goes across. So that's a big part of why I think this medium is right for this as well, because as we break down those barriers, that colonization that I'm representing in this work, the tangled structure of how Canada was built, sort of actually decays, as does the work. So it kind of falls apart. And as it goes along, I try to talk about that, we're breaking down those barriers and tearing apart that tangled web of the structure that we live within, and what does that look like, right? I don't know what the end product will be, but I know what it looks like in this moment of tearing those things down. So yeah, and that's all I can do. That's sort of like my tiny little part of that is part of it. That I don't know what the end result is or what the end will look like. I mean, how these institutions will, move forward. I'm not sure how that will be, but at least I tried to redefine the landscape, right? So that we're included in that landscape and so that everyone is included in that landscape.
Yeah, and you talked a bit about helping other people decolonize and all of that. But like for you and your art, like has your art helped you with like that healing?
Just like I learn as I go, just like everyone else, right? So I think you don't really realize how big of a part capitalism plays in the structure of colonialism. And I certainly did not realize that until I started doing this work. And I took everything out of our apartment, the living room of our apartment, and then, built an installation in our living room shortly after I started this project because I wasn't sure how to do this, right? What to do. And it just became this sort of like everything in our living room I put everything back that was important to me. Mostly it was just bare bones, the furniture and photographs of my family, like just important things, but not the pillows and the blankets and all those things that we pretty up our lives with. But I didn't recognize just like that was part of colonialism. And then I started reading about that to understand what that meant. So I think like everything else and like everyone else, it's a learning curve, right? Understanding like how it affects our world individually, but like out and about too, which we like, how would you know that without like looking at it? And I think oftentimes we don't look, we just sort of like go about our day and whatever. But COVID was a great opportunity for that specifically to say, to look at things a little deeper and see what is happening underneath.
Everywhere in the world, anytime you go anywhere, you're always hearing about something horrible that's happening. Sometimes you can feel helpless. You turn on the news and you're like, oh, like, what can I do? Like we were saying earlier, like I'm just like a single person.
Yeah, exactly. And at least as an artist, I have an outlet for that. I don't even know what I would do if I wasn't. Like, I don't know. And that's a big deal, I think, right? Being able to, like you, being able to have these conversations and learn from other people, right? Because I mean, I don't know anything, but I'm learning as I go, and I just try to be better, a better person, a better artist, a better everything as I go. So something like reacting to the shit show is that the world is right now and that we have to live in. How do you navigate that if you don't have some sort of outlet for help? Whether it's donating to the soup kitchen, like as a non-artist, like those kinds of things, at least it's something. And then some people have some sort of feeling of I'm trying, right? And I think that's the point too. If you're not an artist, there are still ways to help and not just help yourself, right? Like I get pissed off by that, by the sort of apathy, right? You just move on to the next story, right? And I want to do that too. Listen, before I go to sleep every night, I'm like looking at videos of goats playing and stuff, those little mini goats and stuff. Because they're so happy, and that makes me happy, or kittens or puppies or whatever it is, because I have to somehow find a way to not be stressed all the time or sad all the time or all those kinds of things. But at least I think as someone who maybe is a non-artist, a good way to reach out to the world is just by helping in the tiniest way that you can, right? Whether it's, 4 cans of Campbell's soup or whatever it is, just that one thing that says, okay, I know I can't do a lot, but I can do this, or I can volunteer somewhere, or I can, whatever it is, right? Or I know I have a friend who like lives next door to an elderly lady, and she's not that healthy either, this lady that I'm talking about. And all she does is the one garden in the front, she weeds that garden for her. It's just one thing. And it's the tiniest little thing, but it's one thing that's not about you, right? It's about somebody else. And I think that's, for me, this body of work is not about me. It's about all of us, right? That we have to live here together, right? And there's lots of not pleasant things that happen, right? And as bad as you think it is, there's somebody worse off than you. And as bad as you think it is, it can get so much worse, right? So I think I find the selfishness of people nauseating. And so that's why I enjoy work like this, because I don't have the means financially to do anything else but this. Like I can't help in other ways, but I can help by starting conversations and by acknowledging other people's pain and struggles and all those kinds of things. So maybe that's when we're talking about advice to younger artists who want to include activism in their work or advocate for a particular group in their work. It's just that. It's as simple as just do it, right? Even if it's just the tiny little thing, right? Yeah, it's important. And I think it's good for people's mental health too, right?
Yeah, because it feels good to like help other people, as like you get a good feeling after you do that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And with the best of intentions, right? It doesn't have to be complicated or grand or
Like you said, just go into your neighbor's house who's struggling and seeing if you can help them with something.
yeah, like just simple stuff. It doesn't have to be complicated, right? Um, yeah, I don't I sound so silly, but I remember I was at one of the installations, and honestly, I don't remember which one because at some point some of them start to sort of blend together. But anyway, and a lady said to me, "Oh, you need to like tidy that up and like cut off the stray threads and stuff." This sort of obsession with perfectionism, and so now, since that, which was probably like I don't know, let's say 40 installations ago, I never cut them off because it was just like you're right. Like she didn't mean to make me think that way, but it was like, you're right. Why am I doing that? Because I probably would have gone through and cut all the little threads off. And I was like, wait, what am I doing? Like, what does that mean? Anyway, so I don't do that anymore. Like, it's not, This is not about perfect.
That's another colonial view, is that everything has to be like Indigenous people. That's why when they do beadwork, they leave a spirit bead where it's like a purposeful, like, nothing is perfect and it's not supposed to be perfect. You're a human being. Like,
it's so weird to me. It's just such a weird concept, and that I didn't see that before. And also, like, the fading of the work or the wearing of the work. Like, they'll see something and they'll say, not everybody, but lots of people say, oh, that the it's sort of fuzzy where it's rubbed against a tree or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, I know. Is that cool? Like, everything, because it's been like in 16 different places. And each time that it's in a new place, I add another layer of, say, crochet or or I weave in more colors in a weaving. That's why you'll see online my work is the weavings are never complete out to the edges of the circles, because each place it goes, I add more to that. That's representing the people within that community, and the struggles of that community and the stories in that community are within that weaving. So it's not as simple as we'll just make a new one. Like, what the heck? What? No, I'm not going to make a new one. The point is just to reuse these. The point is to be practical. The point is to not be wasteful, right? It's not about, being cheap but like, it's not about that. It's about being purposeful in how I choose the materials, and that they are reused. Like, even things that are quite small, like, well, I mean, there's a limit because, you can only do so much with something that's like a foot long, right? Like, I don't keep everything at this point, but I certainly, like, it's reused. It has to be, because there's not enough. I couldn't possibly. There's not enough hours in the day, right? And I work, as my husband can attest, I work pretty much constantly, right? So, which I'm happy about. And I understand how blessed I am as an artist to be able to do that. So that's a double-edged sword, but I'm glad that I'm able to do that.
There's like a project that you're going to be working on about like the opioid crisis.
So I haven't titled that body of work yet. I start the residency at Harbourfront Centre in Toronto. I have an 18-month residency there in the textile studio to work on a project about the opioid crisis in Canada, which is certainly, Indigenous folks are represented more in negative ways in a lot of statistics. So something like incarceration and deaths by misfortune, or frig that means. Or I saw you grin there. I was very close to me saying a bad word, a really bad word, but I didn't. So no editing needed. But also in things like addiction and overdose, which is, I'm having a hard time with the word overdose, because it's a dose would mean something like I took a dose of Tylenol, right? An overdose would mean I took too much Tylenol. But it's not like someone who overdoses. It's not like a medicinal dosing. So I'm trying to figure out how to express that differently, like use a different word with that. So yeah, so in the month of February 2023, there were 232 deaths in Ontario. And my younger son was one of those deaths. He overdosed. He was poisoned by fentanyl on February 14th, on Valentine's Day, and died on the 17th of February. And so 232 deaths in 1 month in Ontario. If you don't find that frightening, I mean, do you have a pulse? Because people have this particular view of someone who is suffering from addiction. So, and not viewing that as a disease like they would cancer or diabetes or whatever it is. So when I saw that number, I recognized that it's more than just my family, more than just my child. It's so many children, and so many of my son's friends, oh my gosh, are either suffering from addiction or are dead. Like, it's utterly horrific, the number of people, and predominantly male. So that sort of risk taking that males are known for in, comparative to female identifying people. So I just want to be able to talk about that. And so that project, I'll be reaching out to other families and friends who have lost someone to the opioid crisis in Canada, across the country. And what'll be happening is they'll be sending me a piece of fiber. So it could be a piece of clothing, it could be someone is sending me a baby blanket because their father actually died and didn't get to meet their grandchild. So this son is sending me the baby blanket, not something from his father, but something that he would have wanted his father to be participate within. So he's sending me that. So those pieces of textile would be cut into strips, and I will be hand tying those all together into one large piece. Essentially, if you think about something like a hand tied rug, remember those old fashioned rugs that were, some people used to call them rag rugs, right? But it'll be a wall, like a hanging of some kind. And when you think about it, I've sort of lost track. I did have the numbers in my head, but they're not coming to me right now. Since 2016, there's been 26,000 deaths in Canada from opioid related overdose or poisoning. Like that's a insane number, right? So I expect this piece of work to be very large because it just keeps happening too, right? So there's no end date for a body or for that piece because I will continually have to add to it, which is, I think, the poignancy of that piece, or will be the poignancy of that piece, is that unless someone pays attention and gives a shit within the pharmaceutical industry, which we know isn't going to happen, and with our government, which we know is not going to happen, and within our own families and our own communities, we have to end the stigma of mental health and addiction, which is part of mental health. And so until any of those things happen, that body of work will continue to grow. I've come to the realization that maybe that's the only way for people to understand how many people have died from this, right? If we represented other diseases in this way, well, we don't have to, because people care about that, because they care about something where they think it's like a no fault kind of thing, which is such bullshit. But mental health, they think, well, it's just, you got to put just in front of something, there's a problem. But it's just an unhoused person, or it's just someone who can't get their shit together, or it's just someone, whatever, right? Whatever they put in front of that to rationalize the fact that in their mind that person is worthless, as though there's some sort of scale where we put one human being on here, and their life somehow on this other scale is worth more or less. Like, don't pretend that we're civilized when we're still doing this bullshit, because that's absolute nonsense. But we do it, right? Consciously or subconsciously, we do it, every single one of us. So how do we stop that? So that's the next body of work. Although maybe at the end of that one, I will want to paint butterflies and kittens, because I don't entirely know how I'm going to do that body of work, because I've been sent packages already. And I actually had to ask people to stop sending packages because I've never opened any of the packages of clothing or any of the nothing, because I can't yet. Parker's been gone February, March, April. So, a year and 4 months kind of thing. And I'm not ready to actually have to open up another child's clothing or open up that and read the letters. So the other part of this project is each one of the families, I have a waiver that they can sign, that they can include a small story about their family member and a photograph as well. And so I can include those names and photographs. So then it's an actual physical record that their person is woven into as I as I tie our grief together, which is essentially what I'm doing, right? I want to physically do that, but I have to touch every single one of those pieces of clothing. Some of the packages are still in a box. Like, I haven't even opened the box. They know that I've received it, but I couldn't do that. Like, they started sending them almost immediately after I posted the video. And I actually had to privately message people and say, can you just give me a little bit? Because I think I pulled the trigger a little too quickly. It was on my son's birthday, which is April 1st. And so that's when I released the video to say, this is what I'm going to do. And if you want to participate because you've lost a person and you want, to send me something, then you can, not realizing that people actually would. To be frank, I really didn't know that people would be down with that. And oh my gosh, it was insane. I think there was 127 answers within the first couple of days. And I was like, oh my God, what have I done? Sort of thing. And not in a bad way, but just a little bit frightening. Like I was a little scared because that's a lot of responsibility. I'm not just representing my own grief, I'm representing theirs as well. So thankfully, the MNO was so wonderful. And I reached out and said, I need some help, like with counseling, to be able to say it's hard enough to process my own grief and my family's grief and my surviving son's grief. And how do I do that? Plus, be respectful and mindful of the grief of what I can only assume will be thousands of other families. Like, how do I do that? And honest to gosh, I did not realize people would be so receptive to it.
I think it just shows, like that, how you were saying, like weaving the grief together, and then it's just like the impact of like, these aren't just like statistics, right? Of like, these are actual families. Because I feel like even with like the residential school system, it's like, well, I've never been to residential school, but if you go back in my family, right, it's like, I'm still feeling those impacts of what's happened to family members, right? And like the opioid crisis, it's like, just because I didn't die, if I have a family member who's no longer here, like I'm going to be feeling, and like grief takes forever. Like there's no whatever those steps and stages of grief. Like,
but that's another thing too, is things like grief. People don't know what to say. So they say things that are so wildly inappropriate because they don't know what to say. And sometimes just because they're idiots, but it's difficult, right? Especially when it's a child, when it's an out of order death, right? So I think that's another part of this, another layer of that new body of work is talking about that. Sometimes you don't have to say anything. Don't rationalize someone else's grief by saying, oh, they're not in pain anymore. They're not, oh, piss off. Like, don't say that to somebody. Don't say that to a parent. Don't say that. That's a horrible thing to hear, right? Yeah, so I want to talk about that as well. So like I've started a list of like people say this. So instead, maybe say this and sort of like have something on my website or a list when I start exhibiting this saying, here's what I heard in my head from you. This is what you should have said. Because what I'm hearing lots of times is this judgment on parents or on whomever about something like addiction or about mental health or about whatever. It's a pass the buck kind of thing. Like, well, what did you do wrong? And it's like, well, like a parent isn't thinking that anyways. I don't need your help with that. Thanks very much. I already feel bad enough. I don't need your help with feeling guilt. Thanks. So that kind of stuff. So I'm hoping that I can help with that too, right? So certainly if anyone who's listening wants to participate in that, they can go to my website and there is information on there, which is just Tracey-Mae.com. And they can read about Parker, but also read about the project. And I mean, I'd love for them to participate or even just to think about it, like think about what it means within our society to have this be this degree of a problem, right? And you hear about it all the time. So it's not like everyone hasn't been touched by this, because if they say they haven't been, they're lying. And even if it isn't something with someone within your family, it's in your community. Look outside your door, for goodness sake. You can't avoid this. As much as you may have blinders on or whatever, you can't avoid this. So what can we do to help, right? So that's again, how can I help? This is the way that I can help. Again, because I cannot solve this problem, right? There are people who could make this better. They're not you and I, right? But we can do what we can do within our own abilities, right? But you and I can't change the bigger problems, right? But I think something like this starts at a grassroots level, just like everything else that elicits change, right? Like suffrage is how did that start? It started with people like you and I saying, you know what, bullshit, this is enough. I've had enough, right? So this is a way for me to say, okay, you know what, I've had enough. This is enough, right?
It's like as a bigger human family, like as someone who just cares about people, like you should care about the opioid crisis.
But we know that's not reality, don't we? Right? You and I know that. So, but things can change, right? Because people can change. We're adaptable, some of us more than others, right? So how do we, how do we do that? How do we get other people to be on board with those kinds of changes? And I think that's important, right? The starting of conversations is a big deal for me, no matter what it is. Like whatever the issue is being able to do that. I feel like that's a great role of the arts, whatever type of art it is. I think that's um, a great power within what we do, right? Is to be able to start those conversations and have conversations that are really tough, right? Which I know you've done on this podcast. So, and will continue to do because the conversations just get tougher, right? Or maybe they don't get tougher; they just change.
The easy part is acknowledging something happened. The tough part is, okay, how do we make this right? You actually have to do stuff. For reconciliation to happen, you actually have to be doing things, right?
Yeah, exactly. And what does that mean, right? And what is community and whose idea of community is right?
Art helping start that conversation and making sure we don't forget, like, hey, this is still like the opioid crisis. Like, I feel like a couple years ago we saw that in the news and people were like, oh, like moving on to the next thing. And it's like, wait, this still exists. Like, this problem is still happening.
And the issue of mental health being tied to that. And, we're seeing encampments and seeing that's all part of the same problem. And I think people tend to compartmentalize. Maybe it's easier to digest. I don't know. But it's the same problem, for goodness sake. Another sign of a first world nation is how do you treat people who are less fortunate than you and or who are marginalized in that way or who are suffering? How do you treat those people? What's the litmus test? The litmus test is we're looking at it and saying, oh, people all over the world want to live here because it's so wonderful. And I think, what kind of convoluted thing is that? Because again, look outside your window.
Yeah, what brochure did you get for Canada?
Yeah, what brochure did you get? Because
we're not living in that reality.
And maybe some people are, but I don't know how you could not be, like not see what it is and not think, okay, wait, something can help. I don't know what it is, but something can help. So how do you drive change, right? So again, like I said, I don't have the answers. That's not what I'm able to do, but I have answers in that I care enough to say, what can I do to help? Like, how can I do something, right? How can I advocate in some sort of way? So
yeah, I think that's what we're all supposed to be doing, like finding your gift and then how you can make the world better by using that.
Yeah. But you're self-aware enough to recognize that, where I think lots of people are just like, yeah, but I'm going to go do this and then I'm going to do this and then I'm going to do this. And that's completely like other people are just not even in it just doesn't matter because they just go about their day or go about their life until they die. But I wonder if you're thinking about scales, and I'm anti-religious. So like, but if you're thinking about scales of, you were a good person and you did the best you could with what you had, or you were a good person and gave $10 billion to whatever, those are not the same thing, right? Like my husband and I were talking about this yesterday, but like, those are not the same thing to me. Those are not equatable. So, talk the talk, walk the walk. There's no get out of jail free card and there's no get into heaven free, although I don't believe in that, but like heaven, but there's no, just you're a human. It's just do what you can. And if all you're doing is to make you feel better about yourself by whatever, then that's not good. But at the end of the day, people have to be able to look themselves in the mirror right? I can look myself straight into the mirror, right into my eyes. I wonder how many people are kind of looking sideways because, yeah. So, I mean, there are not days that I fail 100%, but there's not a day that I don't try.
Not to leave it on a downer, but yeah, like if people do want to go check out your work and see, like, where can they go?
Yeah, they can go to Tracey-Mae, so TRACEYMAE.com. I think right now I don't know, maybe 15 or 16 installations out there right now. So I'm sorry, there's a schedule here. I'm trying to quickly count, but there's quite a number out across Canada. And then, yeah, and I think I've got like 10 or 12 more to do this year. And then they're somewhere not in every province this year, but like somewhere around there'll be work if you were out and about and you see something weird hanging.
A random crochet piece.
Crocheted, knit, or woven body of work. It might be mine. And then in Toronto, if they happen to be in Toronto, I'll be in Toronto at Harbourfront Centre. My residency starts in September and I'll be there for 18 months. So yeah, they can always come in, like look and see if I'm in and come and visit. I am 100% down for conversations and coffee. So in that order, or rather in the other order, coffee and then conversations kind of thing. So, yeah, 100%. I love that. So, and then if it's about the opioid crisis and wanting to participate in that or help out with that in any way, they can contact me through the website as well.
Merci to Tracey-Mae for sharing her story today. Once again, you can head over to her website, which is in the show notes, to check out her work and even find out how you can contribute to her next piece about the opioid crisis. We got through some super heavy topics today, and I wanted to remind all our listeners to make sure to take a moment for some self-care if you need, whatever that may be. Whether that be smudging or going for a walk through nature. What I really took away from my conversation today was a reminder that we are all in this together. And even though sometimes it doesn't seem like the government or other colonial institutions care about us, we still have each other as a community. We cannot lose hope in ourselves. We are all at different stages in our healing journey, and I hope we can all remember to be kind to one another. On the next episode, we will be taking a somewhat lighter note and talking to children's book author Willie Pohl about Indigenous representation in children's books and how they are infusing activism into those books to teach youth about our history. This episode was written and hosted by Samantha Loney, with music composed by Etienne Beausoleil, edited by Cassidy Villebron-Baracus, and produced by the Metis and Me program. This podcast was made in support from our sponsors, 880 Cities and the City of Barrie's Arts and Culture Investment Program. Remember to like and subscribe for more content. Merci for listening.